I had been driving for the past 2 hours, heading to the Hilton in Philadelphia, where my wife, Laura, was attending a conference. The plan was to surprise her by dropping in and taking her out to dinner. But honestly, for the last 3 months, I'd had my suspicions that Laura might be cheating on me with one of her co-workers. It seemed like every time she went out of town for a business trip or a training session, she would come back later than she originally planned. Tonight, I was set on catching her in the act and finally ending this uncertainty. Laura and I had been married for 14 years, and we have 2 amazing kids. Our 12-year-old daughter, Emily, and our 10-year-old son, Jacob. Right now, they're staying with my mother for the weekend. Laura and I got married right after high school, having dated for 2 years before that. She was always so full of life, with her long brown hair, slender figure, and sharp features. She had a spark about her that I fell for immediately. But about 3 months ago, things began to feel off. I thought we had a solid marriage, but small signs had started to bother me. I hesitated to bring it up, not wanting to seem jealous or overly paranoid. This conference was close enough for me to drop in without warning, and maybe, just maybe, I'd get some answers. At the hotel counter, I handed my overnight bag to the clerk and introduced myself as Ben Riley. My wife, Laura, was at a marketing conference in room 214, and she had apparently left a key for me. After verifying my ID, the clerk handed over the key card, and I made my way to the elevator, my heart pounding. 100 thoughts raced through my mind. Should I knock or just walk in? What if she wasn't alone? How would I handle this? I reached her door and slid the key card in, unlocking it quietly. Stepping inside, I found Laura sitting at the desk, her briefcase open, papers scattered around her. She turned in surprise, her eyes wide. "Ben, what are you doing here?" she asked, clearly caught off guard. I explained that I had some free time and thought I'd surprise her by taking her out for dinner. Laura smiled, relieved, and got up to give me a hug and a kiss. "I didn't expect you tonight," she said, "but I'm glad you're here. Are you staying the night?" Seeing her there, working, I felt ridiculous for having doubted her. I joked about sneaking in a little time together before dinner, and she grinned, suggesting we make it quick before she took a shower, with promises of more fun afterward. We were together briefly, but even then, something still felt wrong. She headed into the bathroom for her shower, leaving me sitting on the bed. I noticed Laura's toiletry bag sitting on the dresser and thought maybe she had some aspirin in there for my headache. I unzipped it and found something that stopped me in my tracks, a box of condoms. My heart sank. Since Jacob was born, Laura had switched to birth control pills, but they made her nauseous, so I had a vasectomy. We hadn't needed condoms in years. So why were they in her bag now? I stared at them, trying to piece it together, and the only conclusion was that Laura was cheating on me. The woman I'd been married to for 14 years was sleeping with someone else. My stomach churned, but I held it together. Instead of confronting her, I took one of the safety pins she kept in her bag and carefully punctured a hole through each condom before putting them back in place. While Laura was still in the shower, I called my friend, Sam, back home. I told him I needed a favor, and without asking questions, he agreed. I told him to call me in about an hour with some urgent excuse so I'd have a reason to leave. I couldn't spend the night with her after what I'd found. He promised to call around 7, giving me an exit. When Laura came out of the shower, I could barely contain my anger, but I kept it in check. I knew confronting her now wouldn't help. We made our way to the hotel restaurant, but my mind was racing. I felt numb. At dinner, I told Laura to order whatever she wanted, but she wasn't that hungry. She settled on a small steak and a glass of rose. As we waited, I couldn't help but ask if she was happy with our marriage. She looked at me, surprised, but then smiled. "Of course I am, Ben. We have a great home, 2 wonderful kids, and I've got the best husband I could ask for. Why wouldn't I be happy?" I forced a smile, trying to act reassured, but I couldn't shake the doubts. I told her I just worried sometimes, and she laughed, calling me silly. "That's why you drove all the way here, isn't it?" she teased. She reassured me that she was happy and couldn't ask for a better husband. But her words rang hollow to me. Dinner passed in a blur, and when my phone finally rang, I excused myself to the lobby, waiting a few moments before heading back to the table. I explained to Laura that my buddy, Sam, had just called to inform me about a broken water pipe at the school, and unfortunately, I needed to head back immediately. I apologized and told her I'd have to cancel our plans for the evening. Laura's face showed disappointment, but I couldn't quite tell if it was genuine. It felt like whether I stayed or left, it didn't really matter to her. Either way, the consequences of her actions would catch up with her eventually. As I headed toward the elevator, a man stepped out and greeted Laura. He introduced himself as Kirk Landry, mentioning that he had come by her room earlier to check in for dinner but didn't get an answer. He extended his hand to me and said, "I'm Kirk. Laura talks about you all the time." I forced a smile and shook his hand, explaining that I had come for the night but had to leave because of an emergency. Riding up the elevator with Laura, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I brought up the issue again, asking her to quit her job. I told her how uncomfortable I was with her working alongside Kirk and reminded her that we had already discussed it before. This was important to me. Laura sighed, clearly frustrated. She said she had no intention of quitting because she enjoyed her job and was learning a lot from Kirk. She insisted that my concerns about him were nothing more than paranoia. After a quick kiss in the room, I picked up my bags and left for the drive home. But I couldn't get the thought of Kirk coming by her room out of my head. By the time I reached the house, I was a wreck. My mind was filled with anger and confusion over what my wife was doing behind my back. I hated her for her betrayal, but I also felt completely lost. I didn't know how to catch her in the act, and without solid proof, I couldn't even think about divorce. I knew she was unfaithful, but without clear evidence, I felt stuck. 2 days later, Laura came back home, acting as though nothing was wrong. She was cheerful and upbeat, which only infuriated me more. I checked her bag and found that one of the condoms with the hole I had made was still there. That Saturday, we attended her company's annual picnic. The kids enjoyed themselves, but I dreaded going, convinced that some of her colleagues were aware of the situation. I felt exposed, trying to keep a low profile and avoid any potential jokes at my expense. Laura seemed to be having a great time, mingling with her coworkers, including Kirk. While they weren't doing anything inappropriate in public, their closeness was obvious, and it made my stomach turn. I was more than fine being ignored. While I kept to myself, a woman approached me. She introduced herself as Janet Landry. She was stunning, with long auburn hair and striking blue eyes, and I was genuinely confused about how Kirk could cheat on someone like her. We exchanged pleasantries, and she suggested we find a quieter spot to talk. We walked over to some benches by the lake, a bit removed from the picnic area, and sat down. I offered to listen to whatever she had on her mind. Janet hesitated before speaking, clearly struggling with how to bring up the subject. At that moment, I realized she knew about the affair. I decided to make it easier for her and told her that I had just discovered it myself. Relief washed over her face as she told me she had known for about 2 months. Janet explained that she was planning to file for divorce and had already hired a private investigator to gather evidence. Her lawyer said that if my wife, Laura, was willing to testify or provide a signed statement, it would strengthen her case. I asked her what kind of proof she had. Janet mentioned that she had photos and recorded phone conversations, but no video footage yet. Still, she believed the photos alone were enough to prove the affair. She also had dates and times that matched everything up. Janet expressed hope that I could help, possibly using my own lawyer and the evidence I had. She said she was also pursuing legal action against the company, stating that certain higher-ups knew about the affair but did nothing to stop it. They would either have to fire both Kirk and Laura or face a hefty lawsuit. Janet looked me in the eye and asked, "Can you come by tomorrow? Kirk is playing golf in the morning and will be gone until the afternoon. I can show you everything I've got, and maybe we can figure out what to do next." She gave me her address, 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crestmont, and we made a plan. Not exactly a date, but we chuckled about it anyway. We walked back to the picnic area, and it seemed like no one had noticed we were gone. I actually felt a bit better, like maybe this mess could finally be resolved. The next morning, as expected, Laura told me she was going shopping for a few hours. After she left, I dropped the kids off at my mom's and drove to Crestmont. Janet greeted me at the door, and we went inside to the den. A comfortable leather couch was set up in front of a large computer monitor, which was displaying an image of an empty motel room. She offered me a drink, beer, soda, or wine, and gestured for me to sit down. I chose a regular soda, specifically a Pepsi. I asked Janet to explain what was about to happen. She told me that in just a few minutes, we'd be watching a live stream of her husband, Kirk, playing a round of golf. She hinted that I might recognize the caddy tagging along with him. Curious, I asked how she had arranged this, and Janet revealed that it cost her $1,400 to set everything up, but she felt it was worth every penny. She expected the session to last about 2 hours and encouraged me to get comfortable. She even joked that she had popcorn and nachos ready and that I'd get a DVD copy of the entire thing if I wanted it. Despite admitting she didn't really want to watch what was coming, Janet also confessed that she wouldn't miss it for the world. "Let the show begin," she said, a mix of sarcasm and bitterness in her voice. We made small talk for about 20 minutes as she filled me in on the evidence she had gathered, photos, recordings, and documents that confirmed everything about the affair. As she talked, the reality of it all crushed me. I had suspected it, but having the truth laid out like that was a gut punch. During the conversation, Janet casually mentioned she had a few large koi fish in her backyard pond. Intrigued, I mentioned how my kids would love to see them, and she seemed happy at the idea. Suddenly, the monitor flickered, and as Janet predicted, Kirk and Laura entered the motel room. They wasted no time, immediately undressing without so much as a word between them. The video feed was crystal clear, although the sound was muffled. My stomach turned as I watched my wife and another man on the screen. I didn't know what to say or do. Janet, trying to lighten the mood, commented, "Wow, you don't see a body like that very often." I forced a smile, but I was too shaken to respond. After a few uncomfortable minutes, I finally turned to Janet and confessed that I couldn't watch anymore. I assumed she wasn't really interested in continuing either. She agreed, saying she didn't care to see the rest, and we shut off the monitor. To be honest, watching my wife in that situation was beyond painful, and doing so with someone else next to me felt even worse. "The whole thing's recorded," I reminded her. "We don't need to sit through it. The lawyers will have everything they need." Janet nodded. "You're right. Besides, the plot seems pretty predictable, don't you think?" She managed a small laugh. "What now? You heading home?" "Actually," I replied, "I'd love to check out those koi ponds you mentioned. I think that'd be way more interesting than watching another 2 hours of, well, you know." Janet's face lit up, clearly pleased that I had shown interest in her hobby. We headed out to the backyard, and as we walked away, I couldn't help but notice that the feed was still running, with Laura already reaching her first climax. The thought made me sick, but I pushed it aside. The koi ponds were amazing, 3 of them, beautifully maintained. I was particularly drawn to the filtration and pumping systems, given my experience as a plumber before I took the job at the school. Janet mentioned how Kirk never helped with any of the maintenance, and she had to hire workers for anything pipe-related. I offered to help her out anytime Kirk was off playing golf, not out of romantic interest, but simply because the koi setup fascinated me. Plus, spending some time with her wasn't so bad either. A couple of hours flew by before we returned to the house. The motel room on the monitor was now empty, signaling it was time for me to head home. Janet promised to call me the next time Kirk had a golf game, so I could bring Emily and Jacob by to visit the koi ponds. She seemed genuinely excited about that. The next few weeks were difficult. Every time Laura took a shower, I'd sneak into her bag to check for new condoms, and sure enough, I kept finding them. I couldn't figure out when she was finding time to use them all, but I made sure to puncture every single one I found. I braced myself for the inevitable day when she'd suddenly need to visit her sister after one of Kirk's golf outings. Meanwhile, the kids would come back from visiting Janet, excitedly showing Laura the drawings they made of the koi fish, proudly telling her the names they had come up with. Laura never made the connection that the koi lady was Kirk's wife, and she seemed relieved that I was keeping the kids busy while she was working. I made 2 more attempts to talk Laura into quitting her job and cutting ties with Kirk, but each time, she flat out refused. The second attempt led to a particularly ugly argument, with her making biting comments about my masculinity. It stung, but at the same time, it only made me more determined to keep doing what I had to do. Then, on a random Tuesday night, Laura dropped a bombshell. She said she'd been feeling overwhelmed and stressed lately and wanted to take a week off from work to go visit her sister. She added that I'd been working hard with all the overtime and long hours, and she thought I deserved a break, too. You could go see your sister, she suggested, as if a visit there would magically solve everything. Laura made it sound like it'd be a great way for me to relax, far better than a year of therapy. She told me she'd take care of everything while she was gone and encouraged me to take it easy. I barely slept that night. My mind was racing, thinking about the mess my life had become and the decisions I had to make. It felt like the moment of truth was finally here. Laura's sister, Nancy, and her husband, Brad, lived about 3 hours away. Brad was an okay guy, though he had his moments of idiocy, especially with Nancy being the one who called all the shots. Coincidentally, their town had 2 clinics for, well, termination services. I had already done my homework and noted down the names, addresses, and operating hours for both. I had even gone as far as familiarizing myself with the terms and conditions of both clinics that Megan might be using, noting that both required a mandatory 2-day waiting period. Based on what I suspected, if Megan's first appointment was on Wednesday, the earliest she could have the procedure done would be Friday, giving her the weekend to recover before heading back home. This left me with a day and a half to finalize my plans, plenty of time. Once Laura set off on her so-called rest and recuperation trip, I got to work. I sat my parents down and explained everything, admitting my failures as a husband and where things stood. They were understanding, offering their support, and the kids were having a great time staying with them. My dad's old truck would come in handy when it came time to move Laura's things out of the house. Meanwhile, the lawyer had everything prepared and would have the paperwork ready for me by Thursday morning. Janet, too, had her documents in order and planned to serve Kirk at the same time I served Laura. The only thing gnawing at me was whether I should give Laura one last chance, though deep down, I knew it was hopeless. Dad and I spent the rest of the day packing up Laura's things. By Thursday morning, after a 3-hour drive, I arrived at the first clinic, only to face disappointment. It didn't work out. That left me with just one more option, the family planning center. I walked up to the receptionist, forcing a confident smile, and explained that I was Ben Riley, and my wife Laura had instructed me to come by to sign some paperwork. A consensual agreement form, I called it. I didn't know the exact title, but I explained it was a form acknowledging that I understood the situation, agreed to it, and wouldn't pursue legal action. The receptionist checked her computer, verified Laura's identity, and mentioned that her sister had already signed for her, but having my signature would be even better. She handed me the file, and I signed just below Nancy's name. Noting that the procedure was scheduled for Friday morning at 11 a.m., Laura was required to arrive an hour early. I casually asked if there were any outstanding payments, reaching for my checkbook, but the receptionist assured me that Laura had already paid the full $800 in cash. There was nothing left to settle. I thanked her for her help, feeling a strange sense of relief, and headed to Nancy and Brad's house. When I got there, the reception I received was insincere at best, bordering on farcical. Laura acted surprised to see me and immediately asked what I was doing there. I explained that my parents had offered to keep the kids for a few days, and I decided to take some sick leave to come and visit. I needed to unwind a little too, I added. The room fell silent as I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. They were scrambling to figure out how to respond. Nancy nodded at Brad, giving him a silent signal to join her in the kitchen. Laura tried to make small talk, clearly feeling the awkwardness. After a few minutes, Brad returned, offering a suggestion. He proposed that we take the next day off, borrow his buddy Jack's boat, and spend the day on the lake, so we wouldn't be bothering the ladies. I agreed, saying that a relaxing day on the water might help me clear my head. I suggested he check if Jack could join us, and Brad said he'd make the arrangements. Everyone seemed relieved by how smoothly things were playing out. Dinner was uneventful, filled with casual conversation, but there was no intimacy between Laura and me that night. She claimed she didn't want her sister to overhear anything. Early the next morning, Jack was waiting with the boat, and Brad was packing a cooler with beer and preparing lunch. We made small talk as we loaded everything into the truck. Just as I was about to get into the passenger seat, I stopped. "You know what, Brad?" I said. "I think I'll sit this one out. You go ahead. Spend the day on the lake." Brad looked confused, asking why I wasn't coming, and I told him I had decided to stay behind and enjoy some peace and quiet. He tried to convince me to go, but I wasn't having it. After a few well-placed words and a threat or two, he gave up. Jack and Brad headed off, leaving me standing in the driveway. I walked back inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and switched off Nancy's cell phone. I then called my dad, who was always up early, and we chatted for about 2 hours while I ignored the constant beeping of call waiting. No doubt Brad trying to reach Nancy. As the sun climbed higher, both Nancy and Laura finally woke up. I said goodbye to my dad, steeling myself for what was coming. Once they were up, I cleared all the missed calls from the landline and turned Nancy's phone back on. We had less than 2 hours before Laura and Nancy would need to head to the family planning center, and the tension was palpable. I knew I was about to face two furious women. After finishing the first pot of coffee, I brewed a fresh one for Laura and her sister. As expected, Laura immediately questioned why I hadn't gone fishing with Brad and Jack. I told her I wasn't in the mood and decided to stick around with them for the day instead. I suggested that we could all grab lunch together, mentioning that I'd be leaving that night and didn't feel like spending the whole day on a boat. Laura shot down the idea quickly, saying that she and Nancy had already made plans for the day and preferred to go by themselves. She emphasized that I could take her out anytime, but she only got to see Nancy a couple of times a year. Besides, she pointed out, I would be around all week. I tried to push back, saying that she could spare just half a day, given that I'd driven all the way down there. I figured she could do her sisterly activities the rest of the week. Nancy quietly left the room and started dialing a number on her cell phone. Meanwhile, Laura sat there looking defeated, like the weight of everything was starting to crush her. From the kitchen, we could hear Nancy screaming at Brad over the phone as if he'd committed some terrible offense. I felt bad for the guy, but then again, he did marry her. Laura insisted that they didn't want me tagging along and made it clear they had their day all planned out. I told her I was at least interested in hearing what these plans were so I could decide if I wanted to join them or find something else to do. I couldn't understand why they couldn't spare a single day for me when they had the whole week to themselves. Jokingly, I asked if they were meeting up with any guys, to which Laura quickly clarified that they weren't. Their plans apparently involved shopping for lingerie, bras, and other carnal items, things they didn't want a man hanging around for. I suggested that most of those stores were in the mall, and I could easily find other things to do while they tried stuff on. I promised I wouldn't be a bother, and even offered to take them out to a fancy lunch to make up for the inconvenience. Just then, Nancy appeared in the doorway, glaring at me without saying a word. Laura saw that arguing with me wasn't going to get her anywhere and finally stood up, clearly frustrated. She told me she was going to get dressed, and Nancy followed her upstairs, but not before calling me a real bonehead under her breath. About 20 minutes later, I noticed the landline phone light up, indicating someone was making a call upstairs. The clock was ticking. They had about an hour left to get to the clinic. I figured they were probably trying to reschedule the appointment, assuming I'd be gone by the evening. If they tried to slip away without me, I planned to follow them, making sure they knew I was there. But I didn't think they'd take that risk. After another 20 minutes, Laura and Nancy came down the stairs, now dressed and ready. Laura, with an edge to her voice, told me it was time to go shopping. Surprisingly, they gave in quicker than I had expected. I suspected that the call upstairs was to the clinic, and they were buying time, thinking they could wait until I left later in the evening. I wasn't trying to stop Laura from going through with it, but I wanted to make it as difficult as possible for her. I insisted on driving, not wanting to risk them ditching me somewhere along the way. We stopped at a service station, and I took my time filling the tank, checking the oil and water, and cleaning the windshield, spending more time on my car than I ever had before. They just sat in the car, fuming. When we got to the mall, I parked far from the entrance to make sure we'd have a long walk in. Once inside, I gave them space, keeping an eye on them from a distance, but otherwise letting them go about their business. I didn't care about what they were buying. They weren't exactly having a great time anyway. They spent most of the time whispering to each other, shooting me annoyed glances every now and then. It was clear they were going through the motions just to show me they'd been shopping. I stayed hidden, keeping them in my line of sight, while they debated what to do. By the time their appointment had passed, I knew I had succeeded in delaying the inevitable, at least for now. Shortly after noon, They met me at the agreed spot in the mall's central court. I suggested we go to the Olive Garden for lunch, and though they weren't thrilled, they agreed. The meal was quiet, with little conversation. On the drive back, I could feel the tension simmering, but I didn't care. In fact, I was silently amused, knowing how upset they were. I had managed to throw a wrench in their plans, and I felt no guilt about it. When we got back to the house, I grabbed a beer and settled on the sofa to relax. Brad returned not long after, and for the next half hour, Nancy berated him like a drill sergeant. He somehow managed to escape for a couple of hours, reappearing just in time for dinner. After the meal, when the women had finished cleaning up, I pulled Laura aside for a private conversation in the kitchen. Nancy glared at me as they both walked out of the room, but I didn't care. I needed to talk to Laura. Once in the kitchen, I cut straight to the point. I told her again that I wanted her to quit her job and stop seeing Kirk Langford. Laura's face twisted in anger. Her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might hit me. She snapped that she didn't want to hear it anymore, furious that I kept bringing it up. She was done wasting her time answering me, insisting that I already knew the answer and nothing was going to change. She gave me an ultimatum: either change the topic or leave. I took a deep breath, reached into the manila envelope beside me, and pulled out a larger legal-sized one. "I've asked you at least 10 times over the last 2 months to stop," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Each time, you refused." I slid the envelope across the table and explained that it contained divorce papers. I suggested she sign them and mail them in whenever she was ready, adding that I had included a self-addressed, stamped envelope for her convenience. If she wanted a lawyer to look them over, she was more than welcome to do so. Laura leaned across the table, glaring at me with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "You can't just divorce me because I won't quit my job or because you don't like my friends," she snapped. "For a divorce, you need grounds. And you don't have any." She crossed her arms and told me to go home and get my act together, emphasizing that she was my wife and had no intention of giving up her home or family just because I had a problem with her job. I sighed, realizing how little she understood the depth of my frustration. Reaching back into the manila envelope, I retrieved a stack of photographs. Calmly, I placed 6 pictures of Laura and Kirk on the table, side by side. Her expression shifted as she stared at the photos, but she stayed silent. I placed another 6, showing them in even more compromising positions. The room fell deathly quiet until, suddenly, Laura began to scream at me, begging me to stop. She accused me of spying, calling me sneaky and worse. She demanded to know why I hadn't confronted her directly and hurled insults at me, calling my actions sickening and perverted. At that moment, my phone rang. It was my dad, letting me know he'd be at Nancy and Brad's place in 10 minutes with all of Laura's belongings. As I hung up, Laura asked who had called. "My dad's bringing your things here," I said, calmly. "The locks have been changed at our house. If there's anything you need that we missed, just let me know and I'll bring it over." She didn't say a word. I handed her another envelope, this time containing the title to her car, which I had signed over to her. Inside was also half of the money from our joint bank accounts, about $200. I explained the arrangements for her to have visitation rights with the kids once a week, with the possibility of an overnight stay once a month, provided she signed a notarized statement about the affair. "Oh," I added, "I've also got a DVD. It's from that little trip you and Kirk made to the Scandia Motel on May 10th. 2 hours long, and it shows everything those pictures do and more." As I started to gather up the photos, I made it clear that I hadn't taken any of them. "I wasn't following you, Laura," I said. "I wasn't obsessed with what you were doing. I just don't appreciate being lied to." Lastly, I pulled the safety pin from my keychain and placed it on the table, sliding it toward her. "This," I said, "is the pin I use to poke holes in every condom you've used for the past 2 months. Her face twisted in disbelief. "You've gone through 48 of them in the last 2 weeks alone. Kirk's been luckier than I ever dreamed of being." Furious, she stood up, calling me every name in the book. "You miserable, disgusting weasel," she shouted. "That's the lowest, most despicable thing I've ever heard." I looked her square in the eye. "No," I replied. "The most despicable thing is cheating on your spouse. I might be a fool, but at least I wasn't unfaithful." Just then, I heard my dad's truck pull up outside. I told her I had to go and that Dad was bringing her stuff. As I turned to leave, I added, "You never even said sorry, Laura. Not once. And I don't expect you will." I wished her well with her procedure on Monday and walked out. That's when the tears finally came. Laura collapsed in the kitchen, sobbing, and Nancy rushed in to comfort her. Meanwhile, Brad followed me out to the porch. He was shaking his head, clearly rattled by everything that had just gone down. "Ben, you can't just throw away 14 years of marriage over a misunderstanding," he pleaded. I stared at him for a moment before replying. "A misunderstanding?" I said, incredulously. "Then why did my wife come down here to see you and Nancy?" Brad looked at his shoes, clearly at a loss for words. After a few awkward seconds, he mumbled an apology and offered to help me unload the truck. We finished unloading in about 10 minutes while Laura's sobs echoed from the kitchen. I didn't know what exactly she was crying about, and frankly, I didn't care. I didn't care anymore. Both Kirk and Laura were fired from Globies the week after everything came out. Laura refused to sign the affidavit I had asked for, but the lawyer assured me we had a strong enough case without it. After that night, I didn't hear from my loving wife at all. She didn't bother to come see the kids, but they didn't seem to mind much. They were spending a lot of time with Janet, and a bond had quickly formed between them. The kids and I spent many days together with her, learning about koi fish and enjoying each other's company. There was no talk of romance between Janet and me during that time. We were careful not to do anything that might jeopardize either of our divorces. For months later, both divorces were finalized. Laura didn't fight hers, but Kirk went down kicking and screaming. He lost the house, the investments, and ended up owing Janet a hefty monthly alimony. Just before Christmas, Laura came by the house with presents for the kids. I kept things polite, not wanting to ruin the holiday spirit. She stayed for about 2 hours, then left as quietly as she had come. We didn't exchange a word about the divorce or the affair, and honestly, I didn't care to. I decided to put the house up for sale, and 2 months later, the kids and I moved in with Janet. It felt like a fresh start. Meanwhile, Kirk took a job in Omaha, and of course, Laura followed him there. For months later, Kirk vanished without a trace, not telling her where he was going. Laura had no choice but to move back in with Nancy after Brad left for a job on the Alaskan pipeline. 2 months later, Nancy received divorce papers from Brad in the mail. The two sisters ended up being good company for each other, left alone to pick up the pieces of their messy lives. As for Janet and me, we found comfort in each other. She adored the kids, and they felt the same way about her. We're planning to get married in June, and every moment we spend together is like practice for the honeymoon. Life is finally starting to look up. Second story. We needed to have a serious conversation. There was no doubt about that. I sat across from Laura, the woman who had been my wife for more than 2 decades, and it was clear that things had changed drastically between us. "It's over," she said, her voice trembling. "Mike and I are done." I nodded, offering her a quiet, almost indifferent condolence. She stood there, wringing her hands together nervously. It had been nearly 3 years since she first promised that everything would go back to normal. In truth, I wasn't surprised it had taken this long. I gently asked her why they had broken up, and Laura, avoiding eye contact, mumbled something about how the spark had faded and familiarity had set in. The whole situation felt all too familiar to me. I couldn't help but recall the conversation we'd had over 2 years ago when Laura first told me that our love life had become boring and that she had started seeing someone else, a younger, more energetic man. She made it clear that the affair would continue, leaving me with an ultimatum: accept it or risk losing everything. Her, the kids, our home, and my job at her father's company. She even had the nerve to threaten me with false accusations of domestic abuse if I pushed back. The memories came flooding back, and the déjà vu was unsettling. Laura reminded me, almost defensively, that she had warned me the affair wouldn't last forever. She thanked me for being patient during those years, as if that was some kind of consolation prize. I shrugged, not offering much in return, and she went on to outline her plans for our future. She suggested we could get back to normal and that I could move back into the bedroom whenever I was ready. She even proposed that I do it right away, citing her emotional distress over Mike's sudden departure. Curious, I asked what had led to the breakup. Tears welled up in her eyes as she admitted that Mike had told her she'd gained too much weight and that he didn't want to be seen with her anymore. He wanted someone younger. I offered her some sympathetic words, but in truth, I felt little sympathy. Instead, I carefully avoided agreeing or disagreeing with Mike's assessment. When she suggested I move back into our bed, I hesitated. I reminded her that our bedroom had been the same bed she and Mike had shared for over 2 years. Laura quickly assured me that Mike had never been in our bed when I was home, only during my business trips or when I was at work, as if that made it better. In a weak attempt to fix things, she suggested we get a new bed the very next day. I couldn't help but respond with a sarcastic comment about how nice that would be. The conversation hung awkwardly in the air before she enthusiastically promised to make things up to me. "We haven't been intimate in over 2 years," she said, "but we can get back to the way things used to be." I was skeptical. Could things really go back to normal after all that had happened? Laura, growing more confident, assured me it could. She seemed to genuinely believe we could return to the life we had before. But I wasn't so sure. The humiliation I had felt in front of our family, friends, and co-workers lingered. I brought up how I had stopped going to our local pub because I couldn't stand running into friends who knew all about her and Mike. She apologized, acknowledging that maybe she hadn't thought it through. She justified her actions by saying that everyone already knew about her relationship with Mike, so she didn't see the harm. She even hinted that my comparisons of Mike's abilities in bed to mine had contributed to the affair. I reminded her of the hurtful things I had heard from our so-called friends about how much better Mike was. Laura tried to smooth things over, saying that Mike wasn't better, just different and more exciting than what we had become. While I understood what she meant, it didn't make it any easier to accept. I told her I wasn't sure I could just move back into that bedroom and pretend nothing had happened. Sensing my hesitation, Laura suggested we take a weekend trip to Brighton, stay at a familiar hotel, and take the Jaguar XK140 out for a drive. She seemed desperate for things to go back to how they were. I remarked on how difficult it would be to return to our old intimacy, especially after everything that had happened. Then, I shocked Laura by telling her that I had sold the Jaguar a year ago, something she clearly hadn't noticed. She stared at me in disbelief, asking how I could sell the car I'd spent countless hours restoring. I shrugged and pointed out how little attention she'd paid to my life while she was wrapped up in her affair. She couldn't believe it. She even suggested using money from her trust or from the company to buy another one. I shook my head, explaining that the Jaguar wasn't for sale, and I questioned where she thought the money would come from. "Laura, you signed away your trust money 5 months ago," I reminded her. "I used those funds for our children's house deposits." She looked stunned, as if this was news to her. "That's where the money went?" she asked, completely oblivious. I sighed and told her I'd informed her about it at the time, but she had been too distracted by her affair and her microphone. Laura shifted the conversation, asking about the family company and how it was doing. "The company's fine," I replied, "but it's no longer owned by us." She seemed completely unaware of the recent sale, and desperate to get a handle on the situation. She asked if we were still wealthy. I let her sit with her confusion for a bit, allowing her to realize just how much had changed while she was wrapped up with Mike. Finally, I told her the truth. Her share from the sale of the company would barely cover the mortgage on the house. She was bewildered. "The mortgage?" she asked, clearly out of touch with our finances. I calmly explained that I had used my half of the sale to purchase a 45-foot sailing yacht, and that I had taken early retirement to spend my days sailing. Laura, horrified, reminded me of her hatred for boats and the sea. I acknowledged her feelings but told her there was no space for her on the boat anyway. "Why wouldn't there be enough room for me?" she demanded, suddenly reconsidering her dislike for the sea. I explained that the yacht was designed for 2 people, me and the deckhand I had hired recently. Despite this, Laura insisted she could still come along, suggesting we explore the Mediterranean or sail to the south of France. She even reminisced about the time she and Mike had spent there last year. I cut her off. "There's only 1 cabin on the boat," I said, which was almost true. Laura blinked, trying to comprehend. "1 cabin?" she echoed, loudly, before asking where the deckhand was supposed to sleep. That's when I dropped the final bombshell. The deckhand is a woman, I said, watching her reaction. She's been sleeping with me for a while now. Laura's face turned pale, and she stumbled over her words. I went on to tell her about Giselle, my 28-year-old French blonde deckhand who was not only skilled in sailing but also a fantastic cook and very passionate in other ways as well. At this, Laura broke down into tears, unable to process everything that was unfolding. The next day, I left for France to rejoin Giselle on the boat, leaving Laura behind, still sobbing. It had taken time, but my plan was finally coming together. What Laura didn't know was that I had also bought a 6-bedroom villa nearby with the money I had saved before selling the company. I was looking forward to enjoying the pool and spending time with Susie, who had a fondness for sunbathing without the top half of her bikini. I also smiled at the thought of opening the garage doors to reveal my old Jaguar XK140, which had been waiting there for me. Soon enough, Giselle and I would be driving it down the coast to a familiar French restaurant we had grown fond of. As for Mike, his luck had run out. One night, outside his favorite bar, he was mugged and severely beaten. He ended up with 5 broken ribs, busted kneecaps, and, worst of all for him, he lost one of his testicles in the assault. It seemed like the tables had finally turned, marking the end of his happy days